My name is Avery Taylor. I am 26 years old. 2 days after we buried my father, I sat in a stifling law office in downtown Lexington, Kentucky. Across the mahogany table sat my father's widow, Brenda, and her 23-year-old son, Connor. Connor spent the entire meeting scrolling on his phone. He wore my father's vintage gold watch. The band was too big for his narrow wrist. It slid down to his knuckles every time he shifted in his leather chair. The air in the room smelled like stale printer ink and Brenda's heavy floral perfume. I teach high school history for a living. I spend my days explaining how empires collapse because of greed and poor alliances. I sat there watching my own family fall apart in real time. The lawyer, a man with an ill-fitting suit and nervous eyes, cleared his throat and read the final will and testament of Richard Taylor. My father left a $1.2 million estate, the family savings accounts, and the historic Maple Ridge Manor entirely to Connor, a kid who dropped out of 3 different colleges and once crashed my late mother's car. I received $1. The lawyer pushed a crisp $1 bill across the table. It sat there next to my lukewarm coffee. He read the attached clause. It stated the dollar was left to me to teach me the value of self-reliance. Those were Brenda's words. She loved that phrase. But the document bore my father's shaky signature. Brenda leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She looked at me with a smile she did not even try to hide. She gave me an ultimatum. I could accept the dollar and forfeit all future claims to the estate, or I could refuse it, and she would immediately file a lawsuit against me for retroactive living expenses from my teenage years. I also had exactly 48 hours to remove my childhood belongings from Maple Ridge before she changed the locks. Connor finally looked up from his screen. He told me to make sure I did not scratch the hardwood floors when I moved my boxes. I looked at the dollar. I looked at Brenda. My chest felt tight, but my hands were steady. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or tell her she was a thief. I reached out, picked up the pen, and signed the legal receipt. I folded the $1 bill in half and slid it into my coat pocket. Brenda let out a short, triumphant laugh. She thought she had broken me. She thought her cheap online legal template had secured her future. She had no idea that my grandmother Clara anticipated this exact moment 11 years ago. She had no idea that by forcing my father to disinherit me with that single dollar, she had just triggered a hidden legal trap. A trap that would leave her with nothing. Before we get into how this all unfolded, if this story speaks to you, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the Savage Revenge Stories channel. I would also love to know who is listening today. Drop a comment telling me your age and what time it is where you are watching from right now. Now, to understand how a father could leave his only daughter a single dollar, I need to take you back 3 years to the day the ghost of Maple Ridge first started fading. 3 years before that insulting $1 bill slid across the mahogany table, Maple Ridge was still a sanctuary. The estate belonged to my grandmother, Clara Taylor. Clara was not just a family elder, she was a Kentucky institution. She built the family wealth from the ground up through shrewd land investments in the 1970s, navigating a male-dominated industry with nothing but a sharp mind and an unwavering stare. She wore tailored wool coats, drank her coffee black, and never spoke a word she did not intend to keep. Maple Ridge reflected her spirit. The house was a sprawling 3-story brick manor surrounded by ancient oak trees. The interior smelled of polished mahogany, old paper, and the faint, constant scent of her lavender cologne. It was a home built on permanence. But permanence is a fragile thing when it falls into the wrong hands. When Clara passed away, the estate transferred to my father, Richard. My father was a good man in theory, but he lacked the spine that defined his mother. He was chronically conflict avoidant, preferring to shrink away from a difficult conversation rather than stand his ground. He inherited the fortress, but he had no idea how to defend it. Enter Brenda. Brenda was a local real estate agent who met my father at a charity luncheon 6 months before Clara died. She had perfectly highlighted hair, a calculated smile, and a radar for vulnerable men with significant assets. She did not look at my father and see a grieving son or a potential partner. She looked at Richard Taylor and saw a highly lucrative early retirement plan. Within 3 weeks of Clara's funeral, Brenda moved her suitcases into the master bedroom. That is when the psychological takeover began. It was not a loud invasion. Brenda was far too cunning to throw a tantrum or make immediate demands. Instead, she executed a slow, agonizing erasure of my family's history. It started with the subtle things. Clara's antique vases disappeared from the foyer, replaced by cheap, modern art. The heavy velvet curtains were swapped out for sterile, white blinds. Then came the day I drove over after finishing a long shift at the high school. I walked up the front steps, pulled my key from my pocket, and slid it into the brass lock. It did not turn. I jiggled the handle, thinking it was just stuck. The mechanism was entirely different. Brenda had called a locksmith while my father was at work and changed the deadbolts on the only home I had ever known. When she finally opened the door, she offered a tight, artificial smile and claimed the neighborhood had been experiencing a string of burglaries. She said she simply forgot to have a spare key made for me. I looked at the shiny new lock. I knew exactly who she was trying to keep out. The true measure of her disrespect revealed itself on the front porch. For 40 years, a massive cast-iron swing hung from the thick wooden rafters. Clara used to sit there every summer evening, drinking iced tea and watching the fireflies over the bluegrass. The swing was a piece of the house's soul. It was heavy, rooted, and timeless. One afternoon, I arrived to find the porch empty. Brenda had hired a junk removal service to haul the cast-iron swing to the local dump. In its place, she arranged a beige, flimsy plastic patio set she bought on clearance at a hardware store. Every time Brenda sat on those plastic chairs, the cheap material whined and squeaked under her weight. That grating, high-pitched squeak became the new soundtrack of Maple Ridge. It was the perfect metaphor for her presence in our family. Cheap, hollow, and entirely out of place. The erasure escalated. A week later, I found 2 heavy cardboard boxes sitting next to the garbage bins at the end of the driveway. I opened them to find century-old family photo albums, pictures of my mother, my grandparents, and my own childhood, sitting next to coffee grounds and discarded mail. I carried the boxes inside and walked straight into my father's study. I set them on his desk. My hands shook as I demanded an explanation. I wanted him to yell. I wanted him to show a single ounce of Clara's fire. Instead, my father looked at the boxes, sighed heavily, and rubbed his temples. He refused to meet my eyes. He stared at the leather blotter on his desk and muttered that Brenda was just trying to declutter. He told me that adjusting to a new marriage was difficult and asked me to please just keep the peace. He chose silence. He chose the path of least resistance, willingly sacrificing his daughter and his mother's memory just to avoid an argument in his own kitchen. I looked at him shrinking in his chair and realized a bitter truth. You cannot force a man to be a father if he would rather be a coward. I picked up the photo albums, walked out the front door, and drove back to my modest apartment near the high school. I stopped fighting for a space in a house that no longer wanted me. I focused on my students. I graded history papers. I paid my own rent. I refused to participate in Brenda's twisted game of territorial dominance, preferring to watch the empire decay from a safe distance. For 2 years, we existed in a state of cold, unspoken estrangement. Then, the phone call came. My father collapsed in the driveway one Tuesday morning. The doctors found an aggressive tumor. The decline was shocking. Within a month, a hospital bed was set up in the ground floor study of Maple Ridge. The scent of old paper and lavender was entirely replaced by the sterile, sour smell of antiseptic and sickness. This is when Brenda's predatory instincts took full control. She positioned herself as the sole gatekeeper. She managed his doctors, intercepted his phone calls, and severely restricted my visiting hours. She claimed she was protecting his energy. In reality, she was ensuring he was completely isolated from any outside influence. During the final 2 weeks of his life, my father was placed on a heavy regimen of liquid morphine. His eyes were constantly glazed. He could barely hold a glass of water, let alone process complex information. I did not know it then, but while I was grading exams across town, Brenda was busy in that study. She bypassed hiring a legitimate estate attorney. A real lawyer would have asked too many questions. Instead, she downloaded a cheap last will and testament template from the internet. She called in a mobile notary with questionable ethics. She stood over my father's hospital bed, placed a pen in his trembling hand, and guided his fingers across the signature line. She rewrote the inheritance while his mind was clouded by narcotics, setting the stage for the ultimate betrayal in that downtown law office. She believed she had secured the entire kingdom for herself and her offspring, but Brenda's greed had a blind spot. She was so focused on stealing my father's wealth that she never bothered to manage the leak in her own boat. The leak came in the form of a 23-year-old kid who viewed my father's bank accounts as his personal playground. Brenda possessed a fatal blind spot. She was meticulous in her manipulation of my father, but she lost all rational judgment when it came to her offspring. Connor arrived at Maple Ridge carrying pristine designer luggage and a staggering sense of unearned entitlement. He was 23 years old, boasting a resume consisting of 3 abandoned university degrees and a graveyard of hollow business ventures. He referred to himself as an entrepreneur. In reality, he functioned as a professional dependent. Our lives existed in a jarring juxtaposition. I spent my evenings grading stacks of sophomore history essays, picking up weekend tutoring shifts, and counting every penny just to chip away at my climbing student debt. I drove a reliable, fading sedan with a heater that rattled. Connor slept until noon in a guest suite larger than my entire apartment. He spent his afternoons lounging on the expensive furniture, brainstorming pitch decks for applications that already existed, funded entirely by Richard Taylor's checking account. High-end electronics, custom-tailored clothing, and premium golf clubs arrived at the front door weekly, all bearing Connor's name and my father's credit card number. Whenever one of Connor's misguided startups inevitably collapsed, Brenda was there to weave a safety net out of delusions. She never held her son accountable for a single failure. Instead, she reframed his chronic incompetence. The consumer market was simply not ready for his visionary ideas. The software developers he hired were jealous of his raw talent and deliberately sabotaged his launch. She spun his sheer laziness into a narrative of misunderstood brilliance. My father would nod along, rubbing his tired eyes, and write another substantial check to cover Connor's mounting debts. The financial drain was steady, suffocating, and sanctioned under the guise of investing in the boy's limitless potential. My father never offered to invest a single dime in mine. The true depth of that disparity crystallized during my final year of college. The incident remains burned into my memory, highlighting the exact moment I realized my father had chosen his new wife over his own blood. Before my mother passed away when I was a teenager, she drove a restored 1968 Mustang. It was painted a brilliant cherry red, meticulously maintained, and always smelled faintly of worn leather and her signature vanilla perfume. After her funeral, my father parked the vehicle in the detached carriage house at Maple Ridge. He covered it with a heavy canvas tarp, preserving it like a museum exhibit. It was the only tangible piece of her I had left in the world. I used to sneak into the garage just to sit behind the steering wheel, close my eyes, and pretend she was sitting in the passenger seat. One rainy Friday night, Connor decided he needed a flashy prop to impress a new date. He did not ask for permission. He did not care about the sentimental value. He simply took the keys from my father's desk drawer, pulled the protective tarp off my mother's memory, and drove the classic vehicle out into the slick, winding Kentucky hills. He returned 3 hours later on foot. He smelled of cheap beer, cheap cologne, and sharp fear. He had taken a wet curve too fast, lost control of the rear tires, and wrapped the front passenger side of the Mustang around a jagged limestone property fence. He left the ruined vehicle abandoned on the shoulder of the dark road and called a rideshare back to the estate. When a flatbed tow truck hauled the wreckage up our long driveway the following morning, I stood on the damp gravel, feeling my chest hollow out. The pristine metal was severely buckled, the glass headlights shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, and the steel frame bent inward like a crushed tin can. I turned to Connor, demanding he face the consequences. I told my father we needed to file an immediate police report, contact the property owner, and let Connor's auto insurance handle the devastation he caused. That is when Brenda stepped between us, deploying her tears like a tactical weapon. She wept loudly, clutching my father's arm, claiming a police investigation would ruin Connor's pristine public record and derail his upcoming business launch. She argued that family protects family, no matter the cost. She spun a frantic narrative where Connor was the tragic victim of dangerous, unlit road conditions, rather than a reckless joyrider who stole a priceless heirloom. She convinced my father that paying for the damages out of pocket was the only discreet, respectable solution. But my father's liquid assets were currently tied up in Connor's previous failed venture. So Richard Taylor made a choice. He contacted his bank and authorized a severe withdrawal from the educational trust he had established for me years prior. He drained the remainder of my college tuition fund to pay the angry limestone fence owner for the property damage and to silence the towing company with a generous cash tip. The vintage car itself was deemed far too expensive to repair. They pushed it back into the dim carriage house, threw the heavy canvas tarp over the crushed metal, and pretended the entire nightmare never happened. I received a brief phone call from my father explaining the shortfall in my tuition account, forcing me to take out private, high-interest loans the very next week just to secure my graduation. A few days after the crash, I stood alone in the quiet, dusty garage. I slipped my hand under the heavy canvas cover and traced my fingertips along the deep, jagged dent on the vintage fender. The cold, broken steel felt exactly like my father's love. It was conditional, easily damaged, and readily sacrificed to protect someone else's comfort. I realized then that logic, fairness, and justice held no power within the walls of Maple Ridge. The only currency recognized in that house was Brenda's emotional manipulation. My father's passive compliance was the blade that cut the deepest. He did not hate me. He just loved his own peace of mind more than he loved his daughter. He was willing to bankrupt my future simply to avoid Brenda's wrath in the present. Connor walked away without a single repercussion, while I carried the heavy financial burden of his recklessness for years. That pattern of self-serving preservation continued right up to the bitter end. 3 years after the car crash, Richard took his final, labored breath in the ground floor study. The local Lexington newspaper ran a glowing, extensive obituary praising his business acumen and dedication to his family. The funeral service at the historic downtown chapel was packed to capacity with the city's elite, former business partners, golf acquaintances, and distant relatives. Brenda arrived wearing a tailored designer black dress and a delicate lace veil that perfectly framed her practiced, sorrowful expressions. She played the role of the devastated, heartbroken widow with award-winning precision. She clung to Connor's arm as they walked down the aisle, dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed linen handkerchief, graciously accepting the whispered condolences of the community. She spoke eloquently about her profound, shattering loss to anyone who would listen. But I knew the dark truth lurking beneath her flawless public performance. 2 days prior to the memorial service, I arrived early at the funeral home to drop off my father's favorite navy suit. I walked down the thick, carpeted hallway and heard familiar voices drifting from the director's office. The heavy wooden door sat slightly ajar. I stopped in the shadows, holding the garment bag, and listened as Brenda negotiated the final burial arrangements. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man with a gentle demeanor, respectfully recommended a modest, solid oak casket to honor my father's stature in the community. Brenda did not hesitate. Her tone was sharp, calculating, and entirely devoid of any mourning. She demanded to see the lowest-tier options available in the catalog. She scrutinized the price sheet with the intensity of an auditor, haggling over the mandatory burial vault fees. Ultimately, she selected a flimsy particle board box covered in a thin, unconvincing wood veneer. It was the cheapest vessel the facility offered. She justified the purchase to the director by stating Richard would not care, since his soul had departed and she needed to preserve the estate's liquid assets for her son's bright future. She spared no expense on her custom mourning attire, yet she buried her husband in bargain basement lumber. That is the exact woman who slid a $1 bill across the table at the will reading. She was meticulous in her greed and flawless in her public execution. As we stood graveside, watching that cheap veneer box lowered into the dark Kentucky soil, Brenda caught my eye across the manicured grass. Her performance shifted for a fraction of a second. A cold, calculated glint flashed beneath her dark veil. She knew I understood her true nature, and she knew she had to silence me before I could expose her to the rest of the family. By the time the final handful of dirt hit the casket, her campaign to destroy my reputation had already begun. The morning after we put my father in the ground, the digital assault began. I woke up in my small apartment, the air thick with lingering Kentucky humidity. My mobile device sat on the nightstand, buzzing with a relentless, rhythmic vibration against the cheap wood. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying dozens of unread messages and missed calls. Lexington is a city that runs on thoroughbred horses, expensive bourbon, and whispered reputations. Gossip travels faster than a summer storm across the bluegrass. Brenda understood this ecosystem perfectly. She knew that whoever told the story first ultimately controlled the narrative. While I spent the evening staring at my ceiling, processing a hollow grief, the grieving widow worked the phone lines. I picked up my device and opened a text from Aunt Susan. Susan is my father's older sister. She spends her Tuesdays playing tennis at the country club and her Sundays judging floral arrangements at the First Presbyterian Church. She values appearances above all earthly virtues. We had not spoken a single word in 6 months. Now her message filled my screen in a dense block of judgmental text. She typed that she prayed for my bitter heart. She claimed I abandoned my father during his final days, leaving poor Brenda to carry the agonizing burden alone. She instructed me to be the bigger person and let the widow find some peace. I read the words twice. The phrasing felt strangely familiar. Then I realized the truth. Carry the agonizing burden alone. Those were not Susan's words. Susan lacked the dramatic flair for such poetry. That was Brenda's exact vocabulary. My aunt was simply acting as a parrot, regurgitating a carefully constructed script fed to her over a tearful phone call the night prior. Uncle David sent an email shortly after. He suggested I seek professional counseling for my deep-seated anger issues regarding my inheritance. Several ladies from the church committee left voicemails. Their tones dripped with weaponized Southern pity. One voicemail came from Mrs. Higgins, the choir director. She spoke in that hushed, breathless register reserved for discussing local tragedies. She advised me that holding on to financial resentment would rot my spirit. She actually suggested I send Brenda a floral arrangement as an olive branch. I deleted the message before she finished speaking. Brenda was executing a preemptive public relations strike. She framed herself as the exhausted, devoted caretaker. She painted me as the cold, estranged, ungrateful child who only cared about the family fortune. The sheer audacity of these people. lecturing me on morality while taking instructions from a woman who buried her husband in discount particle board turned my sorrow into a hardened resolve. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I poured a cup of black coffee and watched the dark liquid settle in the mug. My hands remained steady. A lesser person might have typed out a frantic defense. They might have called Susan, screaming the truth about the cheap veneer casket and the changed deadbolts. They might have drafted a long social media post exposing Connor's financial drain. I did none of those things. I'm a history teacher. I teach my students about the fall of Rome and the propaganda machines of the 20th century. I explain how leaders use strategic misinformation to isolate their targets before a major offensive. You cut off the supply lines, destroy the communication networks, and starve the opposing side of morale. Brenda was executing a classic siege tactic. I knew better than to engage an enemy on a battlefield they designed. If I fought back, I would look defensive. If I raised my voice, I would prove their accusations of my bitter anger. Participating in a manufactured drama only feeds the beast. Later that afternoon, the reality of my new social standing hit me in public. My refrigerator was empty, forcing me to venture out to the local market on High Street. The automatic doors slid open, hitting me with a blast of synthetic air conditioning. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly, pale glow over the linoleum floor. I picked up a carton of eggs, checking for cracks, trying to ground myself in a mundane task. I walked down the produce aisle. At the far end of the row stood Mrs. Gable. She had lived 2 doors down from Maple Ridge my entire childhood. She used to bake me sugar cookies when my mother was undergoing chemotherapy. Mrs. Gable looked up from a display of green apples. Her eyes met mine. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of recognition. Then her features tightened. She averted her gaze, turned her grocery cart sharply, and hurried down the adjacent aisle to avoid speaking to me. The squeak of her shopping cart wheels sounded like a loud siren in the quiet store. The silence in that supermarket felt heavier than a physical blow. The town had rendered its verdict. Brenda handed them a compelling story of a martyr and a villain. The community eagerly swallowed the lie because it was far more entertaining than the boring truth of a weak husband and a greedy wife. I paid for my items in cash. The cashier, a young girl who used to babysit for the neighborhood, refused to meet my eyes. She handed me my receipt with a stiff, uncomfortable posture. I walked out into the glaring afternoon sun, feeling the profound chill of total ostracization. Brenda's smear campaign was an undeniable masterpiece of social engineering. But as I drove back to my quiet apartment, I analyzed her strategy with cold detachment. This was not merely an act of petty spite. Brenda did not care what the church ladies really thought of her. She was building a fortress. She deliberately alienated me from every single extended family member and family friend for a very specific reason. She knew the will reading was approaching. She needed to guarantee that when the lawyer announced my disinheritance, I would have 0 allies in the room. She needed to ensure that if I cried foul, the entire town would nod along and say I deserved nothing. She isolated me to remove any potential witnesses to her theft. She wanted me to feel hopeless. She wanted me to feel so abandoned that I would just surrender the estate and vanish. I parked my car and gripped the steering wheel. I accepted my new reality. True strength often requires standing without a safety net. I embraced the isolation. I wrapped it around myself like armor. Brenda thought clearing the board of all my supporters would guarantee her victory. She failed to realize that fighting alone meant I did not have to worry about collateral damage. Those agonizing days of silent judgment bridged the gap between the funeral and that stifling law office. That is how I managed to sit in that leather chair, surrounded by people who despised me, and watch the lawyer push that $1 bill across the mahogany table without shedding a single tear. I had already grieved the loss of my family. I had already accepted my banishment. I walked out of the downtown law office that Tuesday afternoon with the folded dollar bill burning a hole in my coat pocket. The 48-hour eviction countdown echoed in my mind. Brenda ordered me to clear out my childhood bedroom by Thursday evening, expecting me to pack my memories and slink away into the shadows. I had 2 days left inside Maple Ridge, 2 days to walk those historic halls before the new locks kept me out forever. Brenda thought giving me that window of time was a display of ultimate power. She gave the conquered daughter a chance to collect her scraps. She made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed I was returning to the estate to pack cardboard boxes. She forgot what I do for a living. I do not pack history away. I excavate it. I pulled my car onto the long gravel driveway of my grandmother's estate, looking at the towering brick facade. I was not there to retreat. I was there to hunt. I pulled my sedan up the long, familiar gravel driveway of Maple Ridge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. I parked near the detached carriage house, avoiding the spot where my father's truck usually sat. The 48-hour eviction countdown thumped in my chest like a second heartbeat. Brenda thought she was being generous, tossing me a microscopic window to gather my pathetic childhood belongings before she changed the locks and claimed the fortress for good. She assumed I was returning to weep over old stuffed animals and high school debate trophies. She assumed I would pack my cardboard boxes, lower my head, and quietly exit the stage. She underestimated the specific skill set required to be a good historian. I teach my students that history is rarely found in the official documents presented by the victors. The real story, the unvarnished truth, is always buried in the margins. It is hidden in the footnotes, the discarded letters, and the architecture that people forget to examine. I did not enter Maple Ridge that afternoon as a grieving, disinherited daughter. I walked through the heavy oak front door as a forensic investigator processing a crime scene. The house was eerily quiet. Brenda and Connor had gone into town, likely to celebrate their sudden, unearned millionaire status. I walked past my father's ground floor study, purposefully ignoring the lingering, sour smell of his final days. I did not head upstairs to my childhood bedroom. I had no intention of packing a single box. Instead, I walked straight through the grand foyer, past the modernized kitchen, and out the back door onto the sprawling wraparound porch. I stood there, looking at the cheap, beige plastic patio set Brenda had purchased. The setting sun glared off the flimsy synthetic material. I thought about my grandmother, Clara. Clara was a woman who planned for winters that had not even arrived yet. She was a woman who built her empire by anticipating the weaknesses of the men around her. She loved my father, but she harbored zero illusions about his spine. I knew, with absolute certainty, that Clara Taylor would never leave her only granddaughter completely unprotected against a predator she saw coming from a mile away. I approached the spot where the original heavy cast-iron swing used to hang. When Brenda hired that junk removal crew to haul it away 3 years ago, they ripped the thick iron bolts right out of the ceiling beams. But they also disrupted the wooden floorboards beneath it. I knelt on the painted wood. I ran my fingers along the seams of the planks. The boards directly underneath the footprint of the old swing were slightly uneven, bearing deep, parallel scratches that did not match the natural wear of the rest of the porch. I pressed my weight against one end of a shortened plank. It shifted slightly. I walked back into the house, retrieved a flathead screwdriver from the utility drawer in the kitchen, and returned to the porch. I wedged the metal tip into the narrow gap between the boards and applied leverage. The ancient nails groaned in protest before yielding. I pried up 3 short planks, revealing a dark, hollow cavity between the porch joists. Reaching my arm into the dusty darkness, my fingers brushed against cold, hard metal. I pulled it out into the fading daylight. It was a heavy, waterproof steel lockbox. The combination dial was simple, requiring 4 digits. I did not need to guess. I knew Clara's mind. I spun the dials to my mother's birth year, the only date Clara ever claimed truly changed our family for the better. The lock clicked open on the first try. Inside the box lay a stack of thick, leather-bound ledgers, a smaller, worn velvet diary, and a single, crisp business card. I sat cross-legged on the porch, ignoring the dirt staining my jeans, and opened the velvet diary. As the pages parted, a faint, undeniable scent drifted up into the humid Kentucky air. Lavender. It was the exact cologne Clara wore every single day of her life. The scent was nostalgic and grounding, wrapping around me like a sudden, protective embrace. I began to read. Clara's elegant, slanted handwriting filled every page, detailing her private thoughts from the final years of her life. She documented everything. She wrote about Richard's declining health and his increasing susceptibility to suggestion. But the majority of the entries focused entirely on Brenda. Clara documented Brenda's behavior with chilling, clinical precision, dating back over a decade. She noted the subtle ways Brenda isolated my father from his longtime business partners. She recorded the specific dates Brenda attempted to access the family trust accounts, only to be blocked by Clara's bank managers. Clara saw right through the highlighted hair and the calculated smiles. She recognized the parasitic nature of the woman who had infiltrated our home. One entry, dated just 2 months before Clara passed, made my breath catch in my throat. Richard is a good boy, but he is weak. He will always choose the path of least resistance. When I am gone, that woman will consume him entirely. She will try to rewrite this family's legacy. She will try to steal what belongs to Avery. I cannot make Richard into a stronger man, but I can ensure his weakness does not destroy his daughter. I have set the snare. Now we just wait for the thief to step into it. I traced the ink on the page, feeling a profound, surging wave of vindication. I was not crazy. I had not misread the situation. My grandmother saw the exact same monster I did, and she spent her dying days building a fortress to protect me. I set the diary down and picked up the business card. The cardstock was heavy, textured, and embossed with gold lettering. Thomas Sterling, Estate and Trust Law. The address listed was not in Lexington. It was a private firm located an hour away in Louisville, completely outside of Brenda's local sphere of influence. Clara deliberately chose an outsider, someone immune to the gossip and the social pressure of our small, interconnected community. I picked up the heavy ledgers. They were not just financial records. They were intricate, legally binding copies of Clara's original estate planning documents. They contained the specific, unbreakable framework of a generation-skipping trust, a legal maneuver so complex and archaic that Brenda's cheap online template would shatter against it like glass against steel. I sat on the porch as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the estate into twilight. I gathered the lockbox, the diary, the ledgers, and the business card, tucking them securely into my canvas tote bag. I carefully replaced the loose floorboards, ensuring the porch looked entirely undisturbed. I did not pack a single item from my childhood bedroom. I did not need old sweaters or high school trophies. I had found the only inheritance that mattered. Brenda wanted me to feel hopeless. She wanted me to feel isolated, abandoned, and powerless. But as I walked back to my car, carrying the weight of Clara's brilliant posthumous trap, I realized Brenda had made a catastrophic error. She assumed my silence meant surrender. She mistook my calm demeanor for defeat. She had no idea that I possessed the weapon required to dismantle her entire false kingdom. But having the blueprints for the trap was only the first step. To completely neutralize Brenda and ensure she faced real consequences, I needed more than just a brilliant lawyer. I needed undeniable proof of her crimes during those final, dark days in my father's study. I needed a witness who saw the abuse firsthand, someone Brenda had discarded just as easily as she discarded me. And I knew exactly who to call. The documents in my canvas tote bag felt heavier than bricks as I drove away from the darkening estate. I possessed my grandmother's blueprints, the irrefutable proof of a hidden trust designed to bypass my father entirely. But legal frameworks operate in quiet boardrooms and slow courtrooms. To execute a flawless trap within the next 24 hours, I needed a different kind of ammunition. I needed undeniable proof of a crime. Clara's diary detailed Brenda's long game, but I required hard evidence of the final play. I needed proof of the moment my father signed that fraudulent document. Brenda controlled the environment during those last days. She restricted my visits and curated the medical staff. But Brenda possessed a fatal flaw common among the deeply arrogant. She viewed the working class as invisible. She treated service workers like inanimate objects, assuming they lacked the intelligence to observe or the courage to speak. That blind spot led me straight to Martha. Martha managed the daily operations of Maple Ridge for 30 years. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew the polishing schedule for the antique silver, and she knew the exact temperature Clara preferred her morning tea. My grandmother treated Martha with immense dignity, acknowledging her as the quiet backbone of the household. When Brenda took control 3 years ago, she terminated Martha's employment without a shred of grace. She handed a woman with 3 decades of loyalty a severance check worth 2 weeks of minimum wage and told her to vacate the premises by sundown. However, when my father's illness rapidly progressed, Brenda encountered a problem her vanity could not solve. End-of-life care is grueling work, and professional private nurses demand premium salaries. Brenda wanted to preserve the estate's liquid cash for Connor's impending inheritance. So, she did something incredibly brazen. She called Martha. She offered her a meager, off-the-books hourly rate to cover the dark night shifts, assuming Martha was desperate enough to accept the insult and invisible enough to ignore. Martha took the job. Brenda assumed she had hired a cheap servant. In reality, she had invited a spy into the inner sanctum. I navigated my sedan through the narrow working-class streets on the south side of Lexington. I pulled up to a modest, impeccably maintained duplex. The porch light illuminated a neat row of potted geraniums. I knocked on the front door, the humid evening air clinging to my skin. Martha opened the door. Time had etched deep lines around her eyes, but her posture remained uncompromisingly straight. She wore a simple knit cardigan and offered a warm, knowing smile. She did not look surprised to see me standing on her welcome mat in the dark. She simply stepped aside and gestured toward her small, immaculate kitchen. The space smelled of cinnamon and Earl Grey tea. We sat across from each other at a scarred wooden table. I did not need to explain the cruelty of the will reading or the ticking clock of my eviction. The grapevine in Lexington runs deep, and Martha maintained her own reliable network. I asked her straight out if she saw what happened the night my father signed the papers. Martha folded her hands on the table. She told me she'd been waiting for my knock. She stood up, walked to a kitchen drawer, and returned with 2 items. She placed them carefully on the wood between us. The first item was a worn, spiral-bound notebook. The cardboard cover was frayed at the edges. I reached out and opened the cover. The pages were filled with precise, methodical handwriting. Martha had documented every single dosage of liquid morphine administered to my father during his final month. She recorded the dates, the times, the milligram increments, and his subsequent vital signs. Brenda believed Martha was merely a housekeeper, tasked with changing soiled sheets. She failed to realize Martha possessed decades of practical experience managing Clara's complex health regimens. I ran my finger down a column dated just 2 days before his passing. The dosage spiked dramatically. Next to the number, Martha had written a brief, chilling note. Patient unresponsive, eyes unable to focus, breathing shallow. Martha leaned forward, her voice low and steady. She explained that Brenda dismissed the day nurse early that afternoon. Brenda claimed she wanted private family time. A mobile notary arrived an hour later, a man wearing a cheap suit who smelled of stale cigarette smoke. Then, Martha pushed the second item across the table, a small black USB drive. She explained that Brenda ordered her to wait in the basement laundry room while the notary was present. Brenda treated her like furniture, assuming she would blindly obey. But Martha remembered Clara. She remembered the respect my grandmother showed her, and she saw the theft happening in real time. Instead of retreating to the basement, Martha stood in the darkened hallway just outside the study door. She pressed the record button on her mobile phone. I stared at the plastic drive. My pulse thudded in my ears. I asked Martha if I could listen to it. She retrieved a modest laptop from her living room, plugged in the drive, and hit play. The audio was slightly muffled at first, capturing the ambient hum of the medical equipment. Then, Brenda's voice sliced through the static. Her tone was devoid of any performative grief. It was harsh, impatient, and ruthless. I heard the rustle of heavy paper. I heard Brenda commanding my father to wake up. I heard my father groan, a weak, confused sound that made my stomach twist. He slurred his words, asking for water, asking for me. Brenda ignored his pleas. Her voice escalated, sharp and commanding. She told him the current will was outdated and left Connor unprotected. She told him he owed her for taking care of him. Then came the sound that solidified her fate, the undeniable audio of physical coercion. Brenda instructed the notary to guide his hand. I heard her hiss, telling my father to just hold the pen and follow her movements. She forced his signature onto the fraudulent document while he drifted in and out of a narcotic haze. The recording clicked off. The silence in Martha's kitchen felt deafening. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. Brenda thought she was securing an empire. Instead, she handed the keys of her own destruction to the very woman she treated with the most contempt. Clara built loyalty through mutual respect. Brenda built resentment through supreme arrogance. That fundamental difference was the precise mechanism that unraveled her scheme. Martha did not ask for money. She did not ask for favors. She simply placed her hand over mine and told me to go take back Clara's house. I slid the spiral notebook and the USB drive into my tote bag, right next to the airtight legal ledgers. I thanked her, a profound gratitude settling deep in my chest. I walked back out to my car, the night air feeling crisp and electric. The pieces were no longer scattered. I held the sword and the shield. I had the legal framework to nullify the inheritance, and I possessed the criminal evidence to ensure Brenda faced the severe consequences of elder abuse and fraud. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number on the crisp, embossed business card. It was late, but Thomas Sterling answered on the second ring. His voice was sharp and alert. I introduced myself. I told him I was Clara Taylor's granddaughter. I had her lockbox, and the trap she set 11 years ago was ready to spring. Sterling let out a low, satisfied chuckle. He told me he had been waiting a very long time for this phone call. The 48-hour eviction window was rapidly closing. Tomorrow morning, Brenda expected me to hand over my keys and walk away in defeat. She expected a surrender. She was about to receive a reckoning. The 48-hour window had officially expired. It was Thursday evening, and the Kentucky sun hung low on the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawns of Maple Ridge. I parked my sedan on the gravel driveway for what Brenda assumed would be the final time. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I did not bring any cardboard boxes. I did not bring packing tape or bubble wrap. I carried nothing but my purse, which held a single, crisp business card and a very specific set of expectations. Inside the grand living room, the celebration was already well underway. I walked through the unlocked front door and stepped into the foyer. The house blazed with warm, expensive light. Brenda and Connor sat in the center of the room, lounging on my grandmother's custom-upholstered furniture. They looked like conquering invaders surveying a plundered city. Their feet rested on the antique Persian rug. On the ornate, glass-topped coffee table between them sat a bottle of my father's most prized possession. It was a 25-year-old single malt scotch, a rare vintage Richard Taylor had saved for decades, waiting for an occasion worthy of breaking the seal. Connor held a heavy crystal tumbler in his right hand. The amber liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim as he laughed at a joke his mother just made. He took a careless gulp, drinking the aged scotch as if it were cheap fraternity beer. He still wore my father's vintage gold watch. The heavy metal band slid loosely down his narrow wrist, resting awkwardly against his knuckles. It was a glaring symbol of a boy trying to fill the shoes of a man, failing at every measurable metric. Brenda looked up as my footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. She wore a silk blouse the color of fresh cream and a triumphant, predatory grin that stretched tight across her face. She expected me to walk through that archway with my shoulders slumped, my eyes red from crying, ready to gather my pathetic childhood remnants. She wanted to watch me pack up my history while she drank my father's liquor. Instead, I stood in the center of the archway, my posture straight, my hands resting loosely at my sides. I offered her nothing. No tears, no anger, no desperate pleas for more time. Brenda set her crystal glass down on a silver coaster. She extended an open, manicured palm in my direction. She demanded I hand over the brass keys to the estate immediately. She noted that my eviction deadline had passed 10 minutes ago. Her voice dripped with a condescending sweetness, the kind of manufactured pity designed to inflict maximum humiliation. She asked if I had framed my $1 inheritance yet. She suggested I hang the framed bill in my cramped, rented apartment to serve as a daily reminder of my father's true priorities. She wanted me to know, down to my very marrow, that I had been replaced. I did not flinch. I let the silence stretch between us. I watched her ego inflate, absorbing the toxic arrogance radiating from her pores. In history class, we study generals who lose wars because they throw victory parades before the enemy has formally surrendered. Hubris is a dangerous narcotic. Brenda was intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. Connor chimed in from the sofa. He pointed a finger at me, instructing me to gather my trash and leave the premises before he called the county sheriff to have me escorted off his property. He emphasized the word his, letting the syllable hang in the humid air. Before I needed to formulate a response, the heavy oak front door swung open on its brass hinges. The sudden rush of evening wind swept through the foyer, carrying the scent of impending rain. Footsteps, measured, heavy, and deliberate, echoed across the entryway tiles. Brenda stood up abruptly, her face twisting in sudden outrage at the unannounced entry. She despised losing control of her environment. A man stepped into the warm glow of the living room, halting Brenda's impending outburst. Thomas Sterling was 68 years old, with thick, silver hair swept back from a sharp, distinguished face. He wore an immaculate, charcoal gray suit that spoke of generational wealth, quiet authority, and decades spent destroying people in courtrooms. He did not look like a man who had stumbled into the wrong house. He possessed a gravitational pull that commanded immediate attention. In his right hand, he carried a battered, dark leather briefcase. The leather was scarred and worn at the edges, a relic from a bygone era, bearing the marks of countless high-stakes negotiations and shredded opposing counsels. Sterling did not apologize for the intrusion. He did not introduce himself to the widow or her son. He ignored Brenda entirely, treating her with the same dismissive invisibility she so often weaponized against others. His sharp eyes scanned the room and locked onto mine. He offered a slight, respectful nod, adjusting his posture. He addressed me with terrifying, professional politeness. He asked if I was Avery Taylor. I nodded, confirming my identity, matching his calm cadence. Brenda's voice shattered the formal exchange. Her pitch rose, shrill, frantic, and panicked. She demanded to know who this stranger was and how he dared to trespass in her private residence. She reached across the sofa for her cell phone, threatening to dial emergency services, vowing to press charges and have him thrown in a jail cell. The veins in her neck strained against her pale skin. Sterling slowly turned his head to acknowledge her presence for the very first time. He looked at Brenda the way a scientist might examine a particularly unpleasant insect under a microscope. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep, chilling, clinical detachment. A cold, calculated smile touched the corners of his mouth. He did not raise his voice to match her hysteria. He simply walked forward, moving with a predator's grace, stopping directly in front of the ornate glass-topped coffee table. He stood between Brenda and the open bottle of scotch. Sterling set his weathered briefcase down. He unlatched the heavy brass clasps with 2 crisp clicks. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder bearing Clara Taylor's personal monogram. Without a single word of warning, he dropped the dense file onto the center of the glass table. The loud, authoritative thud echoed against the vaulted ceiling, a physical shockwave that rattled the crystal tumblers and silenced the room. The sound was heavy, final, and inescapable. It sounded like a gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. Sterling adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit jacket. He looked directly into Brenda's wide, trembling eyes. He announced to the room that he had reviewed Richard Taylor's last will and testament. He called it a fascinating piece of amateur fiction, poorly drafted and entirely unenforceable. He declared the document legally useless. The color drained from Brenda's face in an instant. Her smug, triumphant grin vanished, replaced by a hollow, breathless shock. The glass tumbler slipped from Connor's hand, spilling the aged scotch across the antique Persian rug, but neither of them moved to clean it up. The entire power dynamic in the room fractured, shattered, and realigned in a single heartbeat. Brenda had spent 3 years building a fortress of lies, and Thomas Sterling just kicked the main pillar out from under it. Thomas Sterling stood in the center of the living room, a monument of unyielding legal authority. Brenda stared at the thick, leather-bound folder resting on the glass coffee table, her breath hitching in her chest. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, before Sterling began to speak. His voice was measured, resonant, and entirely devoid of empathy. He did not yell. He simply dismantled Brenda's entire reality, piece by piece. He explained that 11 years ago, when Richard first began showing signs of financial mismanagement, Clara Taylor took decisive action. She recognized her son's inherent weakness. She knew he lacked the fortitude to protect the family legacy from external predators. So, Clara bypassed him entirely. Sterling opened the folder. He detailed the mechanics of an irrevocable, generation-skipping trust. It is a formidable legal instrument, favored by the old wealth of Kentucky, to ensure assets are not squandered by an incompetent middle generation. Clara placed the entirety of the Maple Ridge estate, the surrounding acreage, and the core investment portfolios directly into this trust. Richard Taylor never owned Maple Ridge. He was merely granted a life estate. Sterling clarified the term for Brenda's benefit. A life estate meant Richard possessed the legal right to reside on the property until the day he died. He could sleep in the master bedroom, park his car in the carriage house, and drink scotch in the living room. But he held 0 equity. He possessed no right to sell the property, borrow against it, or bequeath it to anyone else. Therefore, the last will and testament Brenda had coerced Richard into signing was a magnificent exercise in futility. Richard could not leave the house or the family fortune to Connor because Richard did not own those assets. He tried to give away a kingdom that never belonged to him. Brenda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Connor remained frozen on the sofa, staring at the spilled scotch seeping into the Persian rug. The intoxicating fantasy of sudden wealth was evaporating before his eyes. Sterling was not finished. He turned a page in the file and continued his systematic demolition. He explained that Clara possessed a profound understanding of human nature. She anticipated Richard might remarry, and she predicted that any woman targeting a weak man with a life estate would inevitably attempt to seize control. Clara knew the usurper would try to eliminate the true heir. So, Clara installed a brilliant, fatal mechanism within the trust. Sterling called it a poison pill clause. The trust was designed to remain dormant, managed by Sterling's firm, providing Richard with a modest living stipend. However, Clara established a specific trigger that would instantly activate the immediate transfer of all assets directly to me, completely bypassing the standard probate process. That trigger was my disinheritance. Sterling looked directly at Brenda. He explained that Clara knew my father would lack the courage to stand up to a greedy spouse. Clara knew the spouse would eventually demand the entire estate, demanding I be written out of the will entirely. Clara designed the trust so that the moment someone tried to steal my birthright, the trap would spring shut. By forcing Richard to leave me that insulting $1 bill, Brenda unknowingly fulfilled the exact legal condition required to execute the trust. Sterling reached into the folder. With one perfectly manicured finger, he slid a certified copy of the original 11-year-old property deed across the smooth glass of the coffee table. The paper stopped right in front of Brenda. The bold, undeniable lettering listed the Clara Taylor Generation Skipping Trust as the sole, undisputed owner of Maple Ridge. Brenda stared at the document. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion a sickly, chalky gray. The arrogant, triumphant grin she wore just moments ago was entirely erased. She realized the horrifying truth of her situation. The $1 bill she forced across the table at the law office was not my humiliating lesson in self-reliance. It was the precise key required to unlock my grandmother's hidden vault. Brenda's own greed had activated the mechanism that locked her out of $1 million fortune forever. She thought she was executing a flawless theft, but she had merely stepped into a snare set by a dead woman a decade in advance. Connor finally found his voice. He stammered, his tone shifting from entitled arrogance to rising panic. He pointed a trembling finger at the deed on the table. He demanded to know what this meant for him, for his businesses, for his future. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide with desperate accusation, realizing the woman who had always shielded him from consequences had just driven them both off a financial cliff. Sterling did not address Connor. He looked at Brenda, delivering the final, crushing blow. He explained that because the life estate terminated the very second Richard Taylor drew his last breath, Brenda and Connor possessed no legal right to occupy the premises. They were not tenants. They held no lease. They were, in the eyes of Kentucky property law, nothing more than hostile trespassers occupying a home that belonged exclusively to me. The power dynamic in the living room had not just shifted, it had inverted entirely. Brenda stood in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by antique furniture she did not own, drinking expensive scotch she could no longer afford, staring at the granddaughter she tried to destroy. I watched her process the magnitude of her failure. I felt no pity. I felt the deep, resonant satisfaction of historical justice. But Brenda was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully. She was a cornered predator, stripped of her camouflage, and cornered animals are notoriously dangerous. As the shock wore off, a dark, chaotic desperation began to pool in her eyes. The legal reality was ironclad, but the physical reality was still highly volatile. She was losing the war, but she was not about to leave the battlefield without attempting to burn the fortress to the ground. The heavy silence in the grand living room lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. It was the kind of quiet that follows a car crash before the sirens start wailing. Thomas Sterling stood tall and impassive, having just detonated a legal bomb that leveled my stepmother's entire world. Brenda sat frozen on the custom upholstery. I watched her process the sheer magnitude of her defeat. The transition from arrogant victor to cornered animal happened in a series of micro-expressions. First came the blank stare of incomprehension, followed by a rapid, shallow intake of breath. Then, the raw, unfiltered panic set in. Her gaze dropped to the certified property deed resting on the glass coffee table, the physical proof that she had just triggered her own ruin. She reached out and picked up her crystal tumbler. Her hand shook so severely, the amber liquid sloshed over the rim, staining her expensive silk blouse. Brenda did not notice the spill. She squeezed the glass tight. Her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white as she gripped the heavy crystal, channeling every ounce of her surging rage into that single object. I thought the glass might shatter under the intense pressure of her fingers. She took a ragged breath, set the tumbler down with a sharp clack, and found her voice. It was no longer the calculated, syrupy tone she used for the church ladies. It was a guttural, venomous rasp. Brenda looked at Sterling, her eyes narrowing into dark slits. She announced that a piece of paper from a decade ago meant nothing to her. She stated that she was still Richard Taylor's lawful widow, and she would not be discarded like an old coat. Sterling opened his mouth to reiterate the statutes of Kentucky property law, but Brenda cut him off with a harsh, piercing shriek. She erupted, shedding the mask of the grieving widow forever. She declared war. She leaned forward, her chest heaving, and outlined a desperate, terrifying pivot. She admitted that she might not possess the clear title to the estate today, but she promised I would not see a single dime of my grandmother's fortune for a very long time. Brenda threatened to hire a team of the most ruthless, predatory litigators in the state. She vowed to contest the validity of the generation-skipping trust, cite marital duress, and tie the entire estate up in the chaotic purgatory of probate court. She promised to drag the legal proceedings out for a decade. She looked me dead in the eyes and detailed her strategy of attrition. She knew my teacher's salary could never sustain a prolonged legal siege. She planned to bury me under a mountain of injunctions, appeals, and exorbitant attorney fees until I was bankrupt and begging for a settlement. I asked her how she intended to pay for this elite legal team, considering she had just been stripped of her golden goose. Her lips curled into a vicious sneer. She reminded me that while Clara's trust protected the real estate and the generational investments, my father still possessed separate, personal checking accounts and modest retirement funds, assets he acquired during their marriage. She fully intended to drain every last cent of my father's remaining personal cash to fund her crusade against his only daughter. She was going to use his own money to destroy my future. The threat hung in the humid air, heavy and suffocating. Before I could formulate a response, Connor interjected. He stood up from the sofa, his face flushed a mottled, angry red. The intoxicating fantasy of his sudden wealth had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, dangerous resentment. He stepped toward me, his posture wide and menacing. He did not care about probate court or legal injunctions. He operated on instant gratification and brute force. Connor looked around the opulent living room, his eyes scanning the antique chandeliers, the hand-carved wainscoting, and the original oil paintings. He told me that if he was being thrown out on the street, he was not leaving empty-handed. He threatened to gut the interior of Maple Ridge before the sun came up. He promised to take a sledgehammer to the imported marble countertops in the kitchen. He vowed to strip the copper wiring from the walls, smash the century-old stained glass windows, and pour bleach across the antique Persian rugs. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He stated that by the time the county sheriff finally arrived to enforce an eviction, the historic manor would be nothing more than a hollow, worthless shell. If he could not inherit the kingdom, he would reduce it to ash. I stood in the archway, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at Thomas Sterling. The brilliant estate attorney remained perfectly composed, an unmovable pillar of the law. But a chilling realization washed over me. Sterling's leather-bound folders, his certified deeds, and his mastery of jurisprudence were incredibly powerful weapons inside a civilized courtroom. But we were not in a courtroom. We were standing in a secluded, sprawling country estate with two desperate, highly volatile people who realized they had nothing left to lose. Legal paperwork is just ink on a page. It cannot physically block a sledgehammer. It cannot extinguish a fire. If Brenda filed her injunctions tomorrow morning, the courts would freeze the assets, leaving the physical property in a dangerous state of limbo. A decade of litigation would drain my finances, and the stress would consume my life. Even if Sterling won the war on contingency 10 years from now, Connor's immediate physical threats meant there might be no house left to claim. I needed to neutralize them tonight. I could not afford to engage in a prolonged siege, and I could not leave them alone on the property for another hour. I needed a strategy that bypassed the legal system entirely. I analyzed the two hostile figures standing before me. I looked at the mother who married for money and the son who felt entitled to it without lifting a finger. Their entire dynamic was built on a foundation of extreme selfishness. Brenda protected Connor only because he was an extension of her own ego. Connor obeyed Brenda only because she funded his lazy lifestyle. There was no genuine loyalty between them. There was no unconditional love. There was only shared greed. I realized the only way to save Maple Ridge was to fracture their alliance. If I fought them together, I faced a united front of legal attrition and physical vandalism. But if I could turn them against each other, they would be far too busy tearing themselves apart to focus their destructive energy on me or my home. I needed to introduce a wedge. I needed to present them with a prize so tempting, so highly concentrated and untraceable, that their mutual greed would override their familial bond. They were desperate for liquid cash, something they could hide from the courts and steal from each other. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing my facial muscles to relax into an expression of feigned defeat. I needed them to believe their threats had worked. I needed them to drop their guard. I lowered my gaze to the floor, mimicking the posture of someone who had just realized they were outmatched. I told Brenda I needed a few moments to think. I told her the threat of a 10-year court battle was too much to process, and I needed to consult with my attorney in private before making my next move. Brenda's posture instantly straightened. The vicious sneer returned to her face, a clear sign she believed she had regained the upper hand. She gestured toward the front door, granting us permission to step outside, mocking my sudden retreat. I turned and walked out the heavy oak door, leaving them alone in the grand foyer. Sterling followed close behind, his expression unreadable. I stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air, my mind racing with historical precedents of fallen empires. I did not need a lawyer for the next phase of this battle. I needed to craft a very specific, very convincing lie, and I knew exactly what kind of bait would send them both spiraling into total self-destruction. I stood on the wraparound porch with Thomas Sterling. The cool Kentucky night air carried the scent of approaching rain and damp earth. Sterling adjusted his leather briefcase. He asked if I was ready for him to file the emergency injunctions in the morning. He warned me that freezing the assets would provoke a brutal retaliation. I told him to hold the paperwork. I explained that a courtroom siege would leave Maple Ridge vulnerable to immediate vandalism. I needed them out of the house tonight, and I needed them to leave willingly. Sterling raised an eyebrow, recognizing a tactical shift. He asked what I planned to do. I told him I was going to give them a reason to turn on each other. I drove back to my cramped apartment. I did not sleep. I went straight to my small home office. As a history teacher, I maintain a collection of antique documents and archival materials for my classroom demonstrations. I pulled a sheet of high-quality cotton rag paper from my desk drawer. It was thick and possessed a distinct woven texture. I loaded the sheet into a vintage 1920s Underwood typewriter I bought at an estate sale years ago. I crafted a letter dated October of 1924. I wrote from the perspective of an independent jewelry appraiser addressing my great-grandfather. I kept the language formal, clipped, and precise. The letter referenced a private inspection of uncut, unregistered South African diamonds. The text confirmed the stones were securely stored within the concealed wall safe in the primary master bedroom of Maple Ridge. I assigned the loose gems a conservative historical value of $25,000. I knew that adjusting for a century of inflation, the current street value would easily exceed $250,000. Untraceable, highly liquid wealth. It was the ultimate prize for two desperate people facing financial ruin. The crisp white paper looked too new. I brewed a strong pot of black tea. I carefully brushed the dark liquid over the cotton rag, letting it seep into the fibers. I dried the page in my oven on the lowest heat setting. When I pulled it out, the edges were slightly curled. The paper had transformed into a brittle, yellowed artifact. It smelled faintly of roasted leaves and age. To an expert archivist, it might not pass a chemical analysis, but to a frantic, greedy woman searching for a lifeline, it would look like salvation. The next morning, I drove back to the estate. The atmosphere inside the house was toxic. Brenda and Connor sat in the kitchen, nursing severe hangovers and mutual resentment. The empty scotch bottle sat on the marble counter. They glared at me as I walked in. I played the part of the defeated daughter. I kept my eyes down. I carried a small cardboard box, pretending to gather a few sentimental items from the pantry. I pulled the stack of old recipes and loose papers from a drawer, slipping my forged artifact into the middle of the pile. As I turned toward the island, I intentionally bumped the edge of the marble countertop. The papers scattered across the floor. I crouched down, scrambling to pick them up in a display of nervous anxiety. I gathered the recipes, but deliberately left the yellowed appraisal letter half hidden under the edge of the kitchen rug. I stood up, clutching my box, and announced I was leaving to meet my lawyer to discuss a settlement. I let my voice crack, just a fraction. Brenda offered a smug, satisfied smirk, assuming her threats of a decade-long probate war had successfully broken my spirit. I walked out the back door, got into my car, and drove to the end of the long driveway. I parked behind a thick cluster of oak trees, out of sight from the main windows, and waited. I knew exactly how the next hour would play out. Brenda was meticulous about her surroundings. She could not stand clutter. Within 10 minutes, she would spot the yellowed paper resting near the rug. She would bend down to throw it away. Then, she would notice the archaic typewriter font and the name of the estate. Brenda read the document. The math immediately calculated in her head. $250,000 in unregistered stones meant no taxes, no probate court, and no paper trail. It was a golden parachute. But a parachute is only built for one. Brenda made a rapid, ruthless calculation. If she shared the discovery with Connor, he would demand half, or worse, steal the entire cash to fund his own escape. Her maternal loyalty evaporated in the face of untraceable diamonds. She folded the brittle paper, slipped it into her pocket, and said nothing to her son. Connor, however, was already operating on a razor edge of suspicion. He had spent the morning watching his mother, knowing she was just as desperate and ruthless as he was. When Brenda excused herself from the kitchen and quietly walked upstairs to the master bedroom, Connor did not stay seated. He followed her. He crept down the carpeted hallway and stood outside the master bedroom door. He heard a strange, rhythmic thumping sound. He pushed the door open. He found his mother standing near the fireplace, gripping a heavy brass candlestick. She was systematically tapping the metal base against the historic plaster walls, pressing her ear to the drywall, listening for a hollow echo that would indicate a hidden steel safe. Connor demanded to know what she was doing. Brenda jumped, startled by his sudden appearance. She tried to lie. She claimed she was looking for a stud to hang a heavy mirror, but her voice trembled and her eyes darted nervously toward her pocket. Connor did not believe a single word. He stepped into the room, his jaw clenched, demanding to know what she was hiding from him. The seed of extreme paranoia had taken root. Connor realized his own mother was planning to secure a hidden asset and leave him to face the impending bankruptcy alone. Brenda realized her son was a volatile threat standing between her and her salvation. The thin veneer of their family unit shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. They were no longer mother and son fighting against an unfair world. They were two predators locked in a cage, realizing there was only enough food for one of them. The psychological trap was set, and the physical destruction of their alliance was about to begin. I sat in my sedan, hidden behind the thick cluster of ancient oak trees near the edge of the property line. I rolled the windows down slightly, allowing the humid morning air to circulate through the cabin. The silence of the Kentucky countryside felt heavy, pregnant with impending disaster. I kept my eyes fixed on the second-story windows of the master bedroom. I did not need to be inside the house to know exactly what was unfolding. The trap had been primed, the bait taken, and the inevitable fracture of their toxic alliance was underway. Inside the grand master bedroom, Brenda stood frozen by the fireplace, the heavy brass candlestick gripped tightly in her hand. Connor stood in the doorway, his face twisted into a mask of suspicious rage. He demanded to know what she was holding in her pocket. Brenda tried to deflect, offering a flimsy excuse about organizing loose receipts. But she was dealing with a young man raised in her own image. Connor recognized the exact cadence of her lies because she had spent his entire life teaching him how to construct them. He lunged forward, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He grabbed the fabric of her cream-colored silk blouse, forcefully yanking the brittle, yellowed paper from her pocket. Brenda shrieked, swinging the brass candlestick wildly, but she missed. Connor stepped back, unfolding the forged appraisal document. His eyes scanned the typewritten text. The reality of $250,000 in untraceable diamonds hit him like a physical blow. Then, a deeper, far more dangerous realization set in. His own mother, the woman who had coddled and protected him from every consequence of his adult life, was actively planning to steal a hidden fortune and leave him with nothing. The betrayal snapped the final, frayed thread of their familial bond. Connor demanded half the stones immediately. He stated it was the only fair division considering she had just driven their legal standing off a cliff. Brenda scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that stripped away the last veneer of her maternal affection. She called him a useless, ungrateful parasite. She listed every failed startup, every maxed-out credit card, and every profound disappointment he had ever brought into her life. She screamed that she had earned this payout by suffering through years of marriage to a weak, dying man. And she was not about to sacrifice her golden parachute to fund another one of his idiotic ventures. The psychological warfare escalated instantly into physical destruction. Connor did not argue further. He turned his attention to the historic plaster walls. He marched down the grand staircase, retrieved a heavy steel crowbar and a claw hammer from my father's basement workshop, and returned to the master suite. Brenda watched in horrified silence as her son approached the ornate wall above the marble fireplace. He swung the heavy hammer with brutal, unrestrained force. The sharp crack of metal hitting plaster echoed through the massive house. A large chunk of the century-old wall crumbled, sending a plume of white dust into the stagnant air. He swung again and again, driven by a frantic, blinding greed. Brenda screamed, commanding him to stop. She realized that if he destroyed the room, he might damage the hidden safe, or, worse, alert the neighbors with the noise. But Connor ignored her. He was consumed by the fantasy of the hidden wealth. Brenda rushed forward, grabbing his arm, attempting to pull him away from the wall. Connor shoved her backward. She stumbled, falling hard against the edge of a heavy antique dresser. The illusion of their mother-son dynamic was entirely obliterated. They were no longer a unified front facing an external threat. They were two desperate thieves locked in a cage, tearing each other apart over phantom wealth. I sat in my car checking the time on my dashboard clock. 45 minutes had passed since I left the forged document in the kitchen. I picked up my mobile device and dialed Thomas Sterling's direct line. He answered on the first ring. I told him it was time. I instructed him to contact the county sheriff and request 2 deputies meet us at the front gates of Maple Ridge immediately. I informed him that the hostile trespassers were currently destroying the interior of the property. Inside the house, the master suite looked like a war zone. The once pristine, pale blue walls were pockmarked with gaping, jagged holes. Wooden lath splinters littered the expensive Persian rug. A thick layer of white plaster dust coated the antique furniture and settled in Brenda's highlighted hair. Connor stood panting, his chest heaving, the steel crowbar hanging limply at his side. He had smashed open 6 different sections of the wall. He found old wiring, thick wooden support beams, and decades of accumulated dust. He found absolutely nothing resembling a hidden steel safe. He leaned against the ruined wall, wiping a streak of sweat and plaster dust from his forehead. He looked at the yellowed appraisal document resting on the nightstand. His gaze shifted from the brittle paper to his mother, who was sitting on the edge of the mattress, weeping in exhausted frustration. A profound, sickening realization dawned on Connor. The letter was dated a century ago. The house had undergone numerous renovations since then. He realized the diamonds might have been moved decades prior, or worse, they might be an elaborate myth. He looked at the devastation he had just caused. He realized he was standing in a ruined room, completely broke, facing an impending eviction and potentially severe criminal charges for the property damage. The fantasy of the hidden diamonds evaporated, replaced by the crushing weight of immediate self-preservation. He needed liquid cash, and he needed it right now. He looked at his mother. Brenda's designer purse sat open on a nearby armchair. During the frantic search, she had haphazardly tossed her personal items onto the upholstery. Resting near the edge of the chair, gleaming in the morning light, was my father's vintage gold watch. The heavy timepiece Connor had worn so arrogantly during the will reading. Connor made a final, ruthless calculation. He knew that watch was worth thousands of dollars at any reputable pawn shop. It was not $250,000 in diamonds, but it was enough cash to fund a quiet escape across state lines before the sheriff arrived. He slowly approached the armchair, keeping his eyes fixed on his mother. Brenda had her face buried in her hands, sobbing over the loss of her non-existent fortune. Connor reached out, his fingers brushing the cool metal of the watch band. He slipped the heavy timepiece into the deep pocket of his cargo pants. He did not say a word. He turned his back on the woman who had shielded him from every consequence of his life, fully prepared to abandon her, to face the legal fallout alone. He took 2 steps toward the bedroom door. He thought he had secured his exit strategy. Then the piercing wail of a police siren cut through the quiet Kentucky morning. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway. Connor froze in the doorway, the color draining from his face. Brenda's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fresh panic. The destruction of their alliance was complete, and now the consequences of their mutual greed had arrived at the front door. I put my sedan in drive and slowly pulled out from behind the oak trees, ready to reclaim my fortress. I shifted my sedan into gear, the tires crunching against the loose gravel as I trailed the 2 county sheriff cruisers up the winding driveway. The morning sun had climbed higher, piercing through the dense canopy of ancient oak trees, but the pale light offered no warmth. Thomas Sterling waited near the front steps of the estate. He leaned casually against the polished fender of his sleek black town car. He looked immaculate. His charcoal suit bore no wrinkles, a stark contrast to the chaotic wreckage we were about to enter. I parked and stepped out. The cool air brushed my face. My pulse maintained a steady, drumbeat rhythm. I felt no fear. I felt the precise, calculating focus of a historian watching the final chapter of a corrupt dynasty write itself. The two deputies exited their vehicles. Their heavy boots struck the stone path. They approached Sterling with familiar respect, recognizing the legendary local attorney. Sterling gestured toward me, introducing the lawful owner of Maple Ridge. He informed the officers that the current occupants were trespassing and actively vandalizing the premises. The senior deputy rested a hand on his utility belt, nodding curtly. We walked up the wide brick steps. The heavy oak front door stood ajar, a clear sign of the frantic panic unfolding inside. We crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. Downstairs, the manor maintained its usual dignified silence. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the transom windows. But from the second floor, a cacophony of destruction echoed down the curved wooden staircase, shouting, the sharp thud of a heavy object striking the floorboards, the guttural sound of a mother and son tearing each other to pieces. I led the procession up the carpeted steps. My hand grazed the smooth mahogany banister. For 3 years I had walked these halls feeling like a ghost in my own life. Today, the ghosts were being exorcised. We reached the upper landing and turned toward the primary suite. The door hung wide open. The deputies stepped into the room first, barking a sharp command for everyone to freeze. I stood just behind their broad shoulders, taking in the devastation. The historic suite resembled a demolition zone. Sections of the century-old plaster lay in jagged, broken heaps across the expensive Persian rug. Splintered wooden lath jutted from the walls like broken ribs. A fine white dust coated every surface, settling on the antique dresser, the unmade bed, and the velvet armchairs. Through the shattered panes of the large bay window, the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol cars parked below pulsed in a hypnotic rhythm. The alternating neon colors reflected off the chalky debris and the scattered pieces of broken drywall, casting a surreal, cinematic glow over the ruined chamber. Brenda stood near the marble fireplace. Her cream-colored silk blouse was stained with sweat and white powder. Connor froze near the doorway, a heavy steel crowbar clattering from his grip onto the hardwood floor. They both stared at the uniformed officers in stunned silence. The adrenaline-fueled rage that had driven their argument evaporated, replaced by the chilling reality of law enforcement. Sterling stepped forward, his polished leather shoes crunching over the fallen plaster. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His tone possessed the chilling clarity of a judge reading a sentence. He addressed the deputies, pointing a manicured finger at the gutted walls. He cited the specific Kentucky penal codes for felony criminal mischief and intentional property damage. He reminded the officers that Brenda and Connor held zero legal right to occupy the residence, making this an act of hostile vandalism against an undisputed estate. Brenda's mouth opened, her chest heaving. She tried to summon her usual indignation. She attempted to weave a lie about looking for a structural leak. Her voice wavered, thin and unconvincing. The officers did not blink. They pulled their radios, murmuring codes into their shoulder microphones. I stepped out from behind the deputies. Brenda's gaze locked onto mine. Her eyes widened, processing my calm demeanor. She realized the yellowed appraisal document had been bait. She understood that I had orchestrated her panic, steering her directly into this snare. Property damage alone would result in a hefty fine and probation, but I was not interested in a slap on the wrist. I reached into my canvas tote bag and retrieved the small black USB drive Martha had given me. I held it up, the plastic casing catching the flashing police lights. I spoke directly to the senior deputy. I explained that the property damage was merely a secondary offense. I informed them that the drive contained undeniable audio evidence of elder abuse, coercion, and fraud. I described how the woman standing by the fireplace had isolated a dying, heavily medicated man. I recounted the forced signature on the fraudulent will, orchestrated to steal a fortune. Brenda flinched as if struck by a physical blow. The color drained from her face, leaving her complexion a sickly, chalky hue. Elder abuse is a severe felony, carrying mandatory minimum sentences. She knew the walls were closing in. She frantically looked around the destroyed room, searching for an exit, a scapegoat, any viable lifeline. Her desperate gaze landed on Connor. Her son was slowly, quietly inching his way backward toward the hallway. He wanted to slip away while the officers focused on his mother's impending arrest. But Brenda's sharp eyes caught a subtle, unnatural weight dragging down the fabric of his cargo pants. The unmistakable bulge of a heavy gold timepiece. The maternal bond, already fractured by the fake diamond hunt, shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable shards. If Brenda was going down, she refused to sink alone. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at her own child. Her voice pierced the dusty air, shrill and venomous. She screamed at the deputies to search his pockets. She declared that he was a thief. She announced that Connor had stolen Richard Taylor's solid gold vintage watch right out of her purse, intending to pawn a priceless family heirloom and flee the state. Connor stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at his mother, his jaw unhinged in profound disbelief. The woman who had coddled him, funded his lazy lifestyle, and protected him from every consequence of his entire life had just handed him over to the police to save her own skin. The deputies moved with swift, practiced efficiency. The younger officer grabbed Connor by the arm, spinning him around and pressing his chest against the doorframe. A quick pat-down revealed the heavy gold watch. The officer pulled it from the pocket, holding the gleaming metal up by the strap. The metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed in the hallway. Connor began to thrash, his face turning a mottled crimson. He yelled at his mother, spitting curses and blaming her for everything. He yelled that the fake will, the destroyed walls, and the stolen money were all her ideas. He called her a parasite. The senior officer approached Brenda. She did not resist. She stood rigid, her shoulders slumped in total defeat as the cold steel cuffs locked around her wrists. The illusion of the sophisticated, wealthy widow was gone. She was just a common criminal, covered in plaster dust, arrested in a ruined room. The officers escorted them down the grand staircase. I walked behind them, listening to the synchronized rhythm of their descending footsteps. We reached the ground floor, passing through the foyer and out the heavy oak front door. I stopped on the wraparound porch. I leaned against one of the thick wooden columns and watched the procession. The cool morning breeze ruffled my hair. Connor was shoved into the back of the first cruiser, his head ducked, his face masked in humiliation. Brenda was guided toward the second vehicle. Right before the officer placed a hand on her head to guide her into the back seat, she turned her head. She looked back at me, standing on the porch of the estate she tried to steal. Her eyes were hollow, vacant pits. The realization of her own hubris had finally crushed her spirit. She had traded her freedom for a handful of phantom diamonds. The car door slammed shut, severing our connection forever. The cruisers shifted into gear, their tires kicking up a cloud of white dust as they rolled down the long driveway. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance, taking the toxic poison out of my family's home. Sterling stood beside me on the porch. He let out a long, slow breath. He remarked that he had witnessed many hostile evictions during his career, but rarely one so poetically self-inflicted. I nodded, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 3 years lift from my shoulders. The immediate threat was neutralized. The fortress belonged to me once again. But securing the physical perimeter was only half the battle. Clara's trust protected the real estate and the generational wealth. However, Brenda had spent 3 years managing my father's separate, personal finances. As Sterling turned his attention to the impending audit of Richard Taylor's checking accounts, a new, dark shadow loomed on the horizon. The criminal charges would put Brenda behind bars, but the financial wreckage she left behind in my father's name was about to reveal a staggering, heartbreaking reality that no trust fund could erase. A week after the sirens faded from the Maple Ridge driveway, the true scope of the devastation came into sharp focus. The criminal charges for elder abuse and property destruction were slowly grinding their way through the county court system. Justice in a courtroom moves at a glacial pace, bound by endless filings and procedural hearings. Financial ruin, however, arrives much faster. Thomas Sterling summoned me to his Louisville office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The polished walnut conference table was covered in neat, meticulous stacks of bank statements, credit reports, and loan originations. He had spent the past 7 days conducting a forensic audit of my father's separate personal accounts. He needed to review the assets outside the ironclad protection of Clara Taylor's generation-skipping trust. I sat in the leather armchair sipping bitter black coffee while Sterling laid out the ledger. The numbers were staggering. During those final 3 years, while my father retreated into his illness and his chronic conflict avoidance, his new wife had been exceptionally busy. Sterling slid a thick stack of past due notices across the table. Brenda and Connor had drained every cent of Richard's modest retirement savings. But they did not stop there. They opened multiple high-limit credit cards in his name. They maxed out every single line of credit to fund Connor's phantom tech startups, designer luggage, and Brenda's expensive wardrobe. They took out staggering personal loans, using forged digital signatures and leveraging the false assumption that they would soon inherit a $1 million estate to pay it all back. Because my grandmother possessed the foresight to lock Maple Ridge and the core investments inside an irrevocable trust, those generational assets remained untouched. The fortress held. The property and the primary wealth were shielded from the creditors. But my father's personal estate was effectively bankrupt. Sterling folded his hands over the paperwork. He explained the harsh reality of Kentucky marital law. Because Brenda initiated these debts during the marriage, and because she was the surviving spouse of an insolvent estate, the liability did not simply vanish into thin air. The creditors were already circling. The crushing weight of those secret loans and maxed-out credit cards now rested solely on Brenda's shoulders. She was facing multiple felony indictments, and she was drowning in a sea of insurmountable debt. She had dug a bottomless pit, intending to bury me, and she had fallen straight into it. I left Sterling's office feeling a strange, hollow sort of vindication. I returned to my normal routine. I stood in front of my sophomore history class, lecturing on the Reconstruction era, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of dates, documented facts, and ringing school bells. On a crisp Friday afternoon, the final bell rang. The students flooded the hallways, their metal lockers slamming shut, their loud voices echoing off the cinder block walls. I gathered my graded essays, packed my canvas tote bag, and walked out the heavy double doors into the faculty parking lot. The autumn air held a sharp chill. I approached my fading sedan, searching my coat pocket for my car keys. A figure stepped out from behind the trunk of the neighboring vehicle. I stopped. My grip tightened on the strap of my tote bag. It was Brenda. She did not look like the arrogant, silk-clad widow who had ordered my eviction just a week prior. The physical transformation was jarring. Her posture, once rigid with unearned superiority, was slumped and hollow. She wore a wrinkled beige trench coat that looked as though she had slept in it. Her normally pristine, highlighted hair hung in limp, unwashed strands around her pale face. But her eyes told the true story. The cold, calculating glint was gone, replaced by the frantic, darting gaze of a cornered prey animal. Dark circles bruised the fragile skin beneath her lower lashes. Dark streaks of cheap mascara ran down her cheeks, a stark contrast to her once perfect, meticulous image. She had been crying long before she stepped into my line of sight. She took a hesitant step forward, raising her hands in a placating gesture. She spoke my name, her voice trembling, laced with a desperate, manufactured fragility. She begged me not to call the police. She claimed she just needed 5 minutes of my time. I stood my ground. I did not reach for my phone, but I did not close the distance between us. I let the cold silence stretch, forcing her to speak into the void. Brenda launched into a frantic, weeping monologue. She spun a pathetic narrative of victimhood. She blamed Connor for the property damage, claiming he acted alone in his rage. She blamed the expensive doctors for the depleted bank accounts. She even tried to blame the mobile notary for the forged will. She wept, the dark makeup smudging further down her face, claiming she was penniless. She told me her defense attorney required a staggering retainer fee to keep her out of a state penitentiary, and the banks had frozen her few remaining credit lines. Then she attempted her final, desperate manipulation. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with fresh tears, and asked for a loan. She wanted a small loan from the trust, just enough to cover her legal fees and secure a modest apartment. She invoked my father's memory. She placed a hand over her heart and whimpered that Richard would never want the woman he loved to end up sleeping on the streets. She said it was what my father would have wanted. I watched her perform. The tears were real, but they were not born of remorse. They were born of terror. She was not sorry for stealing my inheritance, erasing my grandmother's legacy, or isolating my dying father. She was only sorry that she got caught in the snare. I looked at the cheap mascara staining her face. I thought about the cast-iron swing she threw in the garbage. I thought about my mother's vintage car crushed against a limestone fence. I thought about the single, folded $1 bill she had pushed across the mahogany table with a triumphant smirk. She wanted me to act like my father. She wanted me to fold under the pressure of an uncomfortable confrontation. She hoped my empathy would override my logic, just as it had always worked on him. I did not yell. I did not list her crimes or revel in her misery. The power of a historian lies in the ability to deliver the final verdict with objective, devastating calm. I looked her dead in the eyes. The autumn wind swept across the asphalt, chilling the space between us. I told her that my father made his choices, and I was making mine. I stated that I had no intention of rewriting history to suit her current crisis. She reached a trembling hand toward my car door, pleading for a second chance. I unlocked my vehicle. I opened the door and tossed my canvas bag onto the passenger seat. I turned back to the ruined woman shivering in the faculty parking lot. I kept my voice low, steady, and devoid of any lingering emotion. I told her I was simply honoring my father's final will. I said I was teaching her the value of self-reliance. Brenda flinched as the words struck her. The phrase she had weaponized against me just days ago now returned to sever her final lifeline. Her mouth opened, a silent sob racking her thin frame, but I did not stay to watch the fallout. I slid into the driver's seat, pulled the door shut, and turned the ignition. The engine hummed to life. I shifted into gear and drove out of the parking lot, leaving Brenda standing alone in the cold exhaust fumes. I did not look in the rearview mirror. The tie was permanently severed. The external enemies had been neutralized, bankrupted, and handed over to the justice system. The physical walls of Maple Ridge were secure. But as I navigated the winding roads back toward my grandmother's estate, the silence inside my car felt heavier than expected. The war was over, but the battlefield was still littered with the emotional debris of a father who failed me. I needed to confront the ghosts lingering in those historic halls, and I knew exactly where to start looking for answers. The silence inside Maple Ridge felt different now. For 3 years, the quiet had been oppressive, thick with unspoken tension and the constant need to walk on eggshells. Now, the silence felt like drawing a deep breath after being submerged underwater. I walked through the grand foyer on a Saturday morning, a mug of black coffee warming my hands. The estate was finally mine. The legal battles were effectively over. The The hostile trespassers were gone, dealing with their respective arraignments and mounting debts in a separate county. I spent the first few days simply reclaiming the physical space. I moved methodically from room to room, undoing the superficial damage my stepmother had inflicted. I took down the sterile white blinds and restored the heavy velvet curtains my grandmother favored. I scrubbed the hardwood floors, washing away the scuff marks left by careless boots and chaotic arguments. The physical labor served as a necessary purge. It grounded me, reconnecting my hands to the historic foundation of my family. By Sunday afternoon, I reached the ground floor library. This room had always been the beating heart of the house. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with first editions, leather-bound biographies, and decades of accumulated knowledge. Brenda rarely entered this room. She had no use for history or literature. The air here remained untouched, smelling faintly of old paper, binding glue, and dust. I brought in a bucket of warm, soapy water and a soft cloth, intending to wipe down the wooden shelves. I started in the far corner, working my way through the towering rows. I pulled down thick volumes, dusted the covers, and aligned them perfectly along the wooden edges. On the third shelf from the bottom, my hand brushed against a set of vintage encyclopedias. The dark green binding on the letter T volume felt strangely loose. I slid the heavy book from its place. It weighed significantly less than the others in the matched set. I opened the embossed cover. The interior pages were meticulously carved out, forming a neat, hollow square in the center of the text. Resting inside the concealed compartment was a single, sealed envelope. I set my cleaning cloth down on the leather armchair. I lifted the envelope. It was crafted from heavy, cream-colored stationery, the exact expensive paper Clara used for all her formal correspondence. My name was written across the front in her familiar, elegant, slanted handwriting. My pulse slowed to a steady, rhythmic thud. I sat down in the leather chair, tracing the blue ink of my name. I broke the wax seal with my thumb and unfolded the thick parchment. The letter was dated 11 years ago. It was written on the exact same day she established the Generation Skipping Trust with Thomas Sterling. Clara did not waste ink on pleasantries. Her voice resonated through the handwritten lines, sharp and uncompromising. She addressed me directly, explaining the precise architecture of the snare she had just built. She wrote that she watched my father navigate the world with a chronic, fatal passivity. She noted that Richard possessed a kind heart, but kindness without a spine is just an open invitation for predators. She knew his inability to confront conflict would eventually invite a parasite into our home. She predicted that another woman would arrive, spot the weakness, and attempt to consume the legacy. She laid out her fears with the clinical detachment of a general observing a vulnerable flank. Then, her words shifted, softening into a profound, fierce declaration of love. Clara wrote that she could not fix her son. She could not force a coward to become a warrior, but she could protect her granddaughter. She explained that setting the trust required allowing my father to make his own terrible choices. It required letting the trap sit dormant, waiting for the inevitable betrayal to occur. She apologized for the pain she knew I would endure. She wrote that she knew the usurper would try to push me out, and she knew my father would let it happen. But Clara emphasized a crucial truth. She did not leave me undefended. She left me armed. She stated that she knew I possessed the strength to survive the storm. She recognized her own resilience, mirrored in my eyes. She knew I would not break when the pressure mounted. She trusted me to hold the line, to endure the slights and the isolation until the snare finally snapped shut. I reached the final line. You are the true heir to this fortress, Avery. Never let anyone convince you that your worth is tied to their validation. I lowered the heavy cream-colored paper to my lap. The lingering scent of lavender drifted up from the parchment, a sensory ghost reaching out to comfort me. For 3 years, I had held my emotions in a vice grip. I navigated the funeral, the smear campaign, the eviction notices, and the dramatic confrontations with cold, calculated detachment. I had to remain the objective historian, processing facts and executing strategies. I could not afford the luxury of vulnerability while standing on an active battlefield. But the war was won. The battlefield was quiet, and reading the words of a woman who saw my true value across the span of a decade finally shattered the dam. The tears came without warning. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and wept into the quiet solitude of the library. My shoulders shook. I cried for the father I lost long before he actually died. I mourned the relationship we could never build, grieving the profound disappointment of his weakness. But interwoven with that sorrow was a soaring, undeniable relief. I cried out of sheer gratitude for the fierce, unyielding grandmother who reached across the boundary of death to shield me from ruin. The internal conflict of parental abandonment dissolved, replaced by the stabilizing anchor of Clara's fierce protection. I was not discarded. I was chosen. I sat in the leather chair until the tears subsided, leaving behind a clear, sharp calm. The afternoon sun filtered through the library windows, casting warm, golden rectangles across the mahogany floorboards. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. I reached into the front pocket of my denim jacket and pulled out my wallet. I unzipped the side compartment and extracted the crisp $1 bill. Brenda intended this piece of currency to be a humiliating brand. She wanted it to represent my total defeat, a daily reminder that I had been reduced to a meaningless afterthought. She wanted me to look at George Washington's face and feel the sting of rejection. I held the paper currency up to the sunlight. I did not see an insult. I saw the key that unlocked an empire. I saw the physical proof of my enemy's fatal arrogance. I saw the exact sum it cost to rid my life of toxic manipulators forever. I walked out of the library and headed upstairs to the master suite, stepping carefully around the patched sections of drywall where Connor had swung his desperate hammer. I retrieved a custom ornate gold picture frame from a storage closet. I removed the glass, placed the single dollar bill perfectly in the center of the dark velvet backing, and secured the clasps. The transformation was profound. Encased in gold, the dollar ceased to be a joke. It became a trophy of survival. I carried the framed bill down the curved wooden staircase, my footsteps steady and purposeful. I needed to hang this symbol in a place of prominence. I needed it to serve as the cornerstone for the new era of Maple Ridge. I had reclaimed the physical structure and secured the financial assets. Now, it was time to establish a new legacy. I was going to ensure that the history of this house was preserved, not just for my own comfort, but as a permanent, public testament to the power of resilience. I had a vision for the ground floor, a way to honor Clara that would solidify her impact on this town long after we were both gone. 1 year has passed since the sirens faded down the gravel driveway of Maple Ridge. The seasons have cycled through the bitter chill of a Kentucky winter and the humid embrace of another summer. Time possesses a remarkable ability to heal, but true restoration requires deliberate labor. I did not just survive the storm. I dismantled the wreckage and built something enduring in its place. I still teach sophomore history at the local high school. I still wake up early, grade essays in red ink, and stand before a whiteboard explaining the rise and fall of ancient empires. But my evenings are no longer spent in a cramped, rented apartment. My evenings are spent curating the past within the walls of my own home. The first floor of the estate has undergone a sweeping transformation. The sterile, modern fixtures my stepmother installed have been removed, replaced by the rich, warm mahogany and polished brass that my grandmother always favored. But this space is no longer just a private residence. It is a public sanctuary. I converted the grand living room, the formal dining area, and the ground floor study into the Clara Taylor Historical Library. The shelves are lined with local archives, century-old genealogical records, and bound volumes detailing the agricultural history of Lexington. It is a free, accessible space for researchers, students, and community members. I wanted to ensure that the Taylor name was associated with education and preservation, rather than the petty greed that briefly infected these halls. Today, the library is filled with the low, steady murmur of genuine conversation. I am hosting a small autumn reception. There are no expensive caterers, no crystal tumblers of aged scotch, and no performative socialites measuring each other's worth. I serve Earl Grey tea in porcelain cups and warm pastries from the local bakery downtown. The people standing in this room represent the family I chose, rather than the bloodline I inherited. My fellow teachers discuss curriculum changes near the fireplace. The school librarian examines a first edition novel near the bay window. And sitting in the center of the room, occupying the most comfortable velvet armchair, is Martha. Martha wears a bright floral blouse and a warm, uncompromising smile. She is no longer an invisible housekeeper ordered to wait in the basement shadows. She is an honored guest. We share a silent look across the room, an acknowledgement of the secret alliance that saved this fortress. Treating people with dignity is not just a moral obligation. It is the strongest foundation a person can build. The warmth of this gathering stands in stark contrast to the cold reality facing those who are missing from the guest list. Aunt Susan and Uncle David remain blocked on every digital platform. Around the holidays, they attempted to send polite, embossed greeting cards to the estate, testing the waters, hoping to reestablish a connection now that I was undeniably wealthy. I returned every single envelope to the sender, unopened. Blood does not grant an automatic pardon for betrayal. Boundaries are only effective if you enforce them without exception. The fates of the two architects of my misery serve as a daily reminder that unchecked greed always demands a steep toll. Brenda did not stay in Kentucky. The crushing weight of the marital debt she accumulated in my father's name proved insurmountable. With her reputation shredded and her credit score decimated, she became a prime target for relentless collection agencies. Facing potential civil lawsuits and a town that knew the unvarnished truth about her character, she packed her remaining clothes in the middle of the night and fled across state lines. She traded her country club aspirations for a transient life, constantly looking over her shoulder, running from a shadow of her own making. Connor was not fortunate enough to escape. His impulsive decision to destroy the master bedroom and steal a vintage gold watch resulted in a swift, unforgiving indictment. He avoided a state penitentiary by pleading guilty to the felony charges, but the judge showed no leniency regarding his sentence. Connor is currently serving 3 years of strict supervised probation. The young man who once viewed my father's bank accounts as his personal playground now spends his weekends performing court-mandated community service. He wears a neon orange safety vest, picking up litter along the shoulders of the county highways. He is learning the true value of $1 through the grueling, inescapable reality of manual labor. The golden child armor has been permanently stripped away. As the afternoon fades into early evening, my guests begin to gather their coats. I walk them to the heavy oak front door, thanking them for their company. I stand on the wraparound porch, listening to the familiar crunch of their tires on the gravel driveway as they head back toward town. I step back inside and close the door, turning the brass deadbolt. The house settles into a deep, comfortable quiet. There is no squeaking plastic patio furniture. There are no hushed, manipulative arguments echoing from the study. There is only peace. I stand alone in the center of the grand foyer. The autumn sun dips low on the horizon, casting long, golden beams of light through the glass transom windows above the doorway. The dust motes dance in the warm glow, illuminating the main gallery wall. Hanging at eye level is the certified 11-year-old property deed, the legal instrument Clara Taylor forged to ensure her empire would never fall into the hands of a usurper. And mounted directly beside it is a custom, ornate gold frame. The warm afternoon sunlight catches the glass, reflecting a brilliant, shimmering ray across the foyer. Inside the frame rests the crisp $1 bill. The currency Brenda pushed across the mahogany table with a victorious smirk. The currency meant to serve as a final, humiliating brand of my unworthiness. I step closer, studying the intricate green ink and the familiar portrait of George Washington. The item has undergone a profound alchemy. By refusing to break under its weight, I transformed a cruel insult into a magnificent trophy of survival. It is a daily reminder of the exact moment my enemies handed me the key to their own destruction. I trace the edge of the gold frame with my fingertips. I think about the people listening to this story right now. I know there are individuals sitting in quiet rooms, holding on to unfair ultimatums, staring at bank statements that do not make sense, or listening to family members demand sacrifices they have no right to ask for. If you are one of those people, I need you to hear the truth that my grandmother etched into the foundation of this house. We are often conditioned to believe that keeping the peace is the highest virtue a person can achieve. We are told to lower our voices, to absorb the disrespect, and to surrender our boundaries in the name of family loyalty. We are taught that silence equates to strength. That is a dangerous, predatory lie. Silence is not permission. It is merely a temporary pause while you assess the battlefield. Preparation is the ultimate defense. You do not need to scream to win a war. You just need to know exactly where the leverage lies. And you need to possess the patience to wait for your opponent to make a fatal mistake. You do not owe your inheritance, your mental health, or your future to people who view your life as their personal currency. Your worth is not determined by a cheap legal template or a manipulative phone call. Your worth is determined by your refusal to let anyone else write your final chapter. My name is Avery Taylor. I am 27 years old. I stand in the hallway of my grandmother's fortress, surrounded by the history she preserved and the peace I secured. I did not just survive the fire. I kept the ashes, and I used them to build an empire of my own. So, how do we raise children to survive in a world where even their own family members might view them as collateral damage? The answer lies in cultivating the self through strategic wisdom, unshakable ethics, and iron willpower. Avery's survival was not an accident. It was the result of a meticulously cultivated character. She demonstrated that true wisdom is knowing that silence is not surrender, but rather a temporary pause to assess the battlefield and locate the necessary leverage. She embraced her isolation not as a punishment, but as a suit of armor, refusing to engage in the manufactured drama designed to break her spirit. Furthermore, while Connor embraced the pathetic existence of a professional dependent, Avery found dignity in self-reliance, grading history papers and paying her own way. She embodied the ethical truth that treating others with genuine respect, as she and Clara did with the discarded housekeeper Martha, builds an unbreakable foundation of loyalty that can dismantle the most elaborate empire of lies. Avery's resilience was her ability to hold the line through years of isolation and slights without ever breaking her moral compass. If this exploration of family dynamics, hidden traps, and the ultimate triumph of quiet resilience resonates with your own experiences, I invite you to become part of our ongoing conversation. Please subscribe and follow Sophia Vengeance for more stories that strip away the polite facades of modern life to reveal the raw, beating heart of human nature underneath. Join us as we continue to explore the intricate, often dark, but ultimately redemptive facets of the human condition. We are taught from a very young age that family is our ultimate safe harbor. We are told to forgive, to forget, and to offer endless second chances, because conventional wisdom dictates that blood is thicker than water. But the legacy of Maple Ridge demands that we question this deeply ingrained social mandate. Perhaps the most profound act of self-preservation is the willingness to walk away from the very people who share your last name. Ultimately, your worth is not determined by external validation, nor is it defined by a $1 bill meant to humiliate you. It is defined by your absolute refusal to let anyone else write your final chapter. By transforming a cruel insult into a framed trophy of survival, Avery proved a terrifying but liberating truth. The strongest fortress is not made of brick and mortar, nor is it secured by an irrevocable trust. The strongest fortress is built within the self. Sometimes the only way to truly honor your family is to let the toxic illusion of it burn to the ground, so you can finally stand free in the ashes. As you look at the architecture of your own life, you must ask yourself, whose legacy are you protecting today? And more importantly, what is it actually costing you? Thank you for listening to my story. If this narrative resonated with you, if you have ever had to draw a hard line in the sand to protect your own legacy, I want you to claim your space in the comments below. Tell the world what boundary you set that changed the trajectory of your life. And remember, the strongest walls are never built in a single day. But once they are standing, nothing can tear them down.